December 19th, 1944. Deep inside the snow-choked Ardennes, the forest stood silent beneath a ceiling of frost. Pines sagged under white weight, branches cracking softly in the stillness. German infantry huddled in foxholes carved into frozen earth, convinced that the woods themselves were their greatest ally. The terrain was a labyrinth of narrow animal paths, steep ridges, and tangled undergrowth that no vehicle could reasonably cross. For hours there had been only the sound of wind brushing through the trees. Then, softly at first, came a different sound. Metal rattling, engines humming low, tires crunching snow with steady insistence. To the men of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, it felt impossible. American vehicles were not supposed to be here, but the jeeps were coming. The sound of the jeep engine, a small, persistent growl, became the symbolic thread of the story. It was not the roar of a tank or the thunder of artillery. It was an almost modest mechanical pulse, yet it carried through the forest like a quiet declaration of intent. That sound, echoing between trees, signaled something the Germans had not expected: American mobility where mobility should not exist. To understand the astonishment stamped onto German expressions that morning, one must look back to the logic of the Ardennes offensive itself. German commanders selected the region precisely because vehicles could not move easily through its forests. The terrain had shaped battles for centuries. Narrow routes, rigid tree lines, and deep ravines created natural choke points that favored defenders. In 1940, German armor had bypassed these woods entirely, using the broader pathways farther south. Now, in 1944, with their armies stretched thin and their fuel reserves dwindling, German strategists relied on the forest to slow American reaction times. But the United States had brought to Europe a machine that seemed designed for impossible ground. The Willys MB and Ford GPW, universally known simply as the Jeep, were lightweight, agile, narrow enough to slip between trees, and reliable even in bitter cold. According to U.S. Army records, over 600,000 of these small vehicles were produced during the war, more than any armored or artillery piece. They were not just transportation, they were extensions of American doctrine: fast, flexible, improvisational. German infantry expected American armor to be confined to the main roads. They believed the U.S. response to the Ardennes breakthrough would be slow, funneling through predictable avenues. Instead, jeeps began slipping around bottlenecks, appearing where German scouts insisted no wheeled machine could go. Reports from the front described Americans emerging from wooded areas previously judged impracticable for vehicles. The forest, once considered German terrain, became compromised by the simple fact that the Americans refused to treat it as impenetrable. The emotional contrast was stark. German soldiers had grown accustomed to defending choke points, to watching American columns halt when terrain turned difficult. They expected delay, hesitation, predictable caution. But the Americans adapted quickly, turning their jeeps into fast reconnaissance platforms, mobile mortar carriers, stretcher vehicles, and even makeshift gun mounts. With chains wrapped around their tires and engines tuned for cold weather starts, the jeeps crawled through ravines, pushed across shallow streams, and squeezed through gaps barely wider than their frames. A captured German officer later admitted in interrogation that the constant arrival of American mobile parties from directions previously regarded secure caused confusion far greater than their numbers suggested. The sound of those engines, our recurring symbol, became unnerving not because it was loud, but because it came from the wrong direction at the wrong time. One episode preserved in the after-action reports of the 82nd Airborne Division illustrates the scale of the surprise. When American paratroopers moved to reinforce positions near Tropont, jeeps carried ammunition, radios, and medical equipment through forest trails so narrow that even bicycles struggled to pass. The Germans defending the high ground expected days of delay. Instead, American units established strongpoints within hours. What should have been an empty ridge behind German lines suddenly crackled with radio traffic and rifle volleys delivered by men and machines the Germans had assumed were still miles away. For German infantry in the Ardennes, the Jeep became a symbol of American unpredictability. In many diaries recovered after the battle, soldiers mentioned seeing Jeeps appear as if from the trees themselves. Some described them as ghosts, quiet until close, moving fast, carrying weapons teams or forward observers who rapidly adjusted American artillery. The Jeeps turned the forest into an American highway, one invisible to German planning. Historical evidence paints a broader picture. U.S. Army engineering manuals emphasized Jeep versatility, demonstrating how two soldiers could lift one wheel to clear obstacles, how planks could be used to cross ditches, how cable winches could pull the vehicle up inclines. American supply chains ensured fuel and spare parts reached frontline units, even when weather shut down heavier transport. By contrast, German divisions in the Ardennes relied heavily on horse-drawn supply and trucks that froze in the cold. In that environment, the Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a statement about industrial reliability and adaptive design. The German perspective gradually transformed. At first, they dismissed the Jeep as a light, fragile machine. As the battle progressed, they began to understand that its strength was not armor or firepower, but opportunity, the ability to deliver men, messages, and momentum quickly. German officers revised their maps, shifting defensive expectations not around hills or roads, but around the increasingly unpredictable paths American Jeeps could carve through the forest. Every time the engine's hum returned, our symbolic sound, it reminded German troops that they were fighting a military system built on abundance. America could afford mobility. It could afford experimentation. It could afford thousands of lightweight vehicles, spare parts, and fuel deliveries at a scale Germany could no longer match. The Jeep's persistence mirrored the industrial strength behind it, a strength rooted in democratic collaboration, workers, designers, and soldiers all contributing to a machine that could redefine a battlefield. By late December, as the German offensive faltered, the Jeeps continued to arrive across snow-bright trails, carrying fresh ammunition and evacuating the wounded. They linked scattered American units into an interconnected defense that the Germans had never predicted. The forest that was meant to shield the German attack became the stage on which American mobility proved decisive. And so the story returns to that winter morning. Silent woods, frost hanging in the air, and the improbable hum of engines approaching through the trees. That sound, humble yet relentless, marked the unraveling of German assumptions. It was the sound of a small machine backed by a vast idea, that flexibility and abundance could overcome even the most forbidding terrain. In the poetic quiet after the war, veterans remembered the Jeeps not as symbols of power, but of possibility. They were reminders that freedom often moves in small, determined steps, sometimes on four wheels, sometimes on snow-packed trails, always toward the open spaces where tyranny cannot easily follow. The German infantry were surprised because the forest they trusted had betrayed them. But the trees had not changed. The world had. The Jeep, with its simple engine hum, carried the truth of that change, a truth about ingenuity, resilience, and the unstoppable momentum of a free people rising to meet history.